Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about employment rates among women, and what I'm talking about today comes from joint work that I've been working on with my University of Maryland colleague, Catherine Abraham. This is part of a much bigger project that we've been doing for a while now, trying to explain declines in employment rates more generally. And so today I'm pulling out some of the key elements, I think, of what we've been seeing going on with women in particular. So the big point in all this of what happens with women's employment and sort of the general statements I'm making would hold if we looked at labor force participation rates instead of actual employment. Female employment rates had been rising steadily for many decades. So from 1976 to 1999, there was a 14.2 percentage point increase. Women's employment rates increased all the way to 57.4%. But then around 2000, the turn of the century, those rates stagnated and they've been falling since. And so that's a concern not only in terms of thinking about women's continued economic progress, but it also has broader implications for aggregate economic performance and productivity, since women's contributions to the labor force have been sort of a steady force pushing up our aggregate economic growth. And so you see from 1999 to 2016, there's been a decrease in women's employment rate of 3.3 percentage points. Now, I think to understand what's going on and potentially what's behind these factors, it's really important to put them side by side with what's been happening to male employment rates. And so the rise in the earlier decades that I've mentioned was a contrast to the steady but slow decline in male employment rates. Sorry, that's supposed to say from 76 to 99. Over that period, male employment rates fell from 72% to 71.6%. In the latter period, males' employment rates have fallen even more sharply than women's employment. And so this is going to come up when I talk about the factors that are behind this. But I think the right way to think about this really is that females are now 50% of the workforce. And so it's probably not surprising that the same aggregate trends and the secular forces that are hitting male employment rates are also affecting women's rates of employment. Okay, so I'm going to show you two figures to give you a broader sense of what's been happening over a longer time period. And what I've done here is broken this up by educational categories. And the four educational categories we focus on are those with less than a high school degree, some college, and college graduates. So just focusing on the top where these trends, these employment trends are documented for women, you can see that the rates of college-educated women have consistently been and continue to be much higher than those of less educated women. So the red line at the top shows that women with college degrees are working about 80%, and if we look at the lowest educational category, those without a high school degree, it's generally below 40%. What's harder to see in these figures where they're on the same scale, but I will show you in a minute when I put the numbers in a table, is that there's been a decrease in employment rate that's primarily among non-college educated women. And we see the same disparities in both levels and trends if we look at the men plotted below. So for men, college educated men still consistently work at about 90% rate. The least educated men, those without a high school degree, have much lower rates of employment, and their employment rates have declined in the past 20 years. And we also see sizable decreases among those with high school degrees and some college. So this is actually, let me just point out something, because this sometimes surprises non-labor economists. In general, in the data, those with some college but not college degrees, they look much more like those with high school degrees as opposed to those with college degrees. And I pause on that because I will come back to that at the end when I mention some of the policy implications, I think, of this work. Okay, so like Mark, it must be an economist thing. My preference is to have lots of numbers and tables. I've tried to be restrained here. But what I did want to highlight is for every age group among prime age workers, we're seeing a decrease in employment rates. So I've just listed here employment changes for those aged 25 to 54. So those are people that we consider prime age employment. And so the fact that they are working less is of concern, again, not just for the economic security of individuals and families, but for our broader economic performance as a country. And what you see is that for each 10-year group, the employment rates have fallen. This is just for women. That statement also holds for men. The other thing that's really, I think, striking and clear in the data is that the decreases have been pronounced and almost limited to those without college degrees. So the orange highlighted boxes, you can see that the fall in employment among those with college degrees is much smaller than those with less than college education. I also think that that speaks to the way the sort of well-being or interpretation of these. So sometimes we see stories in the newspaper, anecdotes about higher educated women opting out of the workforce at higher rates than they used to. That is not what's driving aggregate trends in female employment. The aggregate trends are much more driven by less educated women working less. And I'll also point out, it's not that they're marrying men who are working more. Remember, in an assortative mating sense, less educated women are much less likely to be married. And when they are married, they're more likely to be married to these men who are also working at lower rates. So the reduction in employment here, I think, is sort of best thought of as like undesirable economic consequences, as opposed to reflecting choices of women who have lots of resources. Okay, so now I split it out by age group, and I think there are important and interesting differences across age. So again, let's start by looking at the top figure. You see the biggest drop has been among that solid red line, and those are women aged 16 to 24. And their employment rates have been fallen since the early 90s. Now, part of that is driven by the fact that women are going to school in larger numbers and staying in school for longer. And it's also largely reflective of reduced employment among students. So it's less clear that those decreases are, they're not unambiguously undesirable. But the fact that the youngest cohort of women is seeing the largest declines in labor force is something I think has important implications for thinking about going forward, to the extent that it's not all driven by students. The top three lines are, again, the prime age women, and you can see that after many decades of consistent rise, there's been a steady but slow fall in their employment rates. And the counterpoint here is that older women, plotted in the dotted line at the bottom, their rates have been steadily rising since the early 90s. And so that's, I think, an interesting and noteworthy trend. What that is being driven by is mostly that cohort of women being more educated than previous cohorts of older women. And so they've accumulated more experience and education over their years. And so that's what that's reflecting. We see very similar trends by age if we look at men, with the exception that older men's employment rates have generally been flat, as opposed to the rise that we've seen for women. Okay, so here I'm just going to pull out the key numbers to show just how different the increase in employment among older women is as compared to the younger women. And again, we see for each of the age groups, there's falling for the prime age groups. Okay, so let me give my sort of overview sense of what Catherine and I have concluded are the factors driving the decline in employment. And this comes from, as I mentioned, a much larger project. We reviewed 130-some studies that have looked at the various potential explanations for declining employment rates. We've pulled what we think are the best estimates of causal effects from that literature and combined it with data on what's actually happening to those factors in the US economy or US policy over this period from 1999 to 2016. And from that work, we've concluded that the largest factors behind the decline in employment for both men and women are really reductions in the demand for non-college educated workers. And the two biggest culprits are increased trade with China and technological advances, in particular the adoption of industrial robots. Now, it perhaps isn't surprising that men have been hit harder by those forces, in part because they've tended to work in the industries that have been most hard hit by these factors. Two other factors that we have concluded have been contributing factors, not to the same extent as the changes in demand for labor, but non-negligible, are an increased reliance on disability benefits. This is particularly true for the older individuals. There's been a lot of important work, Mark Duggan has contributed to it, showing that there's a causal link between access to benefits and more generous benefits and decreases in employment. And as we've seen more women working and qualifying for disability insurance, it's probably not surprising that they too are responding to these policy changes. There's obviously a very contentious literature on the disemployment effects of minimum wage. Our conclusion from that literature is that for younger workers, there seems to be some negative effect, and states have been increasing their minimum wages, and so that's potentially contributed a bit to the decline in work among younger workers. And finally, there's very clear evidence that increased access to affordable childcare increases rates of female employment. What's less clear over this period is whether that situation has actually gotten worse, but there's certainly anecdotal stories suggesting that women now are more likely to have irregular schedules and things like that. That makes it harder to find suitable, affordable childcare, and so that's a potential contributing factor that we're sort of putting a question mark next to, and we think we need more research to be able to say decisively. Okay, in my remaining minute, but maybe we'll have more time to talk about this later, I think this all points to the potential for 4 types of policy levers that we might pull. The first is, because the decline in employment for both men and women is so reflective of changing nature of the demand for labor and the demands of the modern workforce, there's no doubt in my mind that we need a concerted effort to increase the availability of relevant skills, training, expanded apprenticeship opportunities, expanded access to education and training in a lifelong sense. We can't think that we're just going to educate people from 18 to 22 when they're going to be set for life anymore. And we need to do much more on that front. I also think we need to do much more to ensure that people who are going to college are completing college. We have a college completion in this country. Community colleges are exceptionally important to getting people into the higher education landscape, and completion rates among students going to community colleges are abysmal in this country. So I think we need to push on that. We can have well-designed reforms to the disability insurance system so that workers aren't making a choice of either trying to stay in low-paying jobs with with pain and other things versus having a lifetime annuity of $300,000. We could do smart reforms to make it more compatible to working part-time or to helping people get back to work. Tax reform to increase return to work for women. This was a missed opportunity, in my view, in the recent tax bill. We pool income in this country, and so if you're a working spouse, you get hit with the top marginal tax rate of the primary earner in that family. For low to moderate income spouses, sending 2 spouses to work yields very low return. People lose their Medicaid benefits, they lose their EITC, they lose their SNAP benefits, they pay payroll tax. With a simple tweak to the federal tax code, we could ameliorate that situation, and as a result, we'd see more married women going to work. And finally, I think we need a dedicated commitment to expanding access to affordable quality childcare in this country, and if we did, we would see higher rates of female employment. Thank you.